So with that in mind, I'd like to now ask our four panelists to come up. Frank, Brian, Dr. Lee, and Simon. Can we give them a hand? Frank, who some of you may not have met from Cornell, he's an expert on the law of artificial intelligence, algorithms, and machine learning. And if you haven't read them already, he's got two outstanding books: the Black Box, which was published in 2015, and the New Laws of Robotics, which he published in 2020. Professor Brian Lowe, from locally here from NUS, he's a leading AI expert. He serves as the Director of AI Research at AI Singapore and the Deputy Director of the NUS AI Institute. Dr. Lee Xianglong, who's the Group Chief Technology and Digital Officer at ST Engineering. Look, he's bringing really invaluable private and public sector experience in AI. He also serves on the expert group supporting the Public Sector Data Security Review Committee. And last and certainly not least is Professor Simon Chesterman, which I think many of you know. He's a vice provost at NUS. He's also the founding dean of NUS College, formerly the dean of NUS Law School, and he serves as senior director of AI governance at AI Singapore and editor of the Asia Journal of International Law. So what I'm going to do is ask one by one, perhaps first Brian, then Frank, then Simon, and Dr. Lee, maybe just a couple of opening remarks, and then we'll kind of dive right into the conversation.
I'm Brian. I have this vision, right, that the folks from governance and the folks from the technical area of AI research will be able to collaborate and work together towards the development of technologies. Why do I say that? Is because, as a technical person, we'll be often asking ourselves things like, what is fairness, right? What is fairness? And we often accuse each other, oh, this is not fair. But that's equality, not fairness. Now, on the other hand, I've heard about people in governance asking, is differential privacy, which is a technical concept, does that guarantee absolute privacy, right? So, if both parties can come together and work together, we're not just going to be able to guarantee technologies that are technically feasible. They can be legally and ethically feasible as well. Yeah.
Super. Frank?
Thank you. Thanks, Ed. And it's great to be coming after your presentation, which I think really clarified a lot, and to be coming after Brian, whose work is, I was recently writing with Hao-Chen Sun about copyright and generative AI, and your work is going to be very crucial, I think, to understanding exactly those types of issues and how far the law can go. Just in terms of my opening remarks, I just had a couple of opening remarks about sort of thinking about some shifts that I see happening. And one of the, I think in terms of the overarching framework of national AI policies, supranational AI policies, there's been a lot of attention over the past decade or so about risks and rights. Right? And so there's an idea that there are some things that AI just should not do to people, and that's sort of a rights-based framework. For example, I believe we would not want to have AI sentencing people to prison. That's something that I think is something that is basically a human capacity that has to be exercised by humans who can understand the consequences. And then on the risk side, there's an analogy of AI to consumer products that we all know. And I think that this sort of risks framework has informed a lot of the regulatory response around the world. I think what's kind of interesting happening now, one of the shifts that I'm seeing is a shift toward more of an industrial policy framework, not assuming that the market is necessarily in the lead and the state comes in afterward to clean up after it, but instead assuming that the state is sort of in the lead and is sort of pushing the market, pushing research in certain directions. This is a shift that Rana Foroohar has talked about as a shift from efficiency to resilience. And I think what's so fascinating here is that when we think about that type of shift, it complicates AI regulation significantly, because I think very good AI regulation is really premised on cooperation, both at a national and international level, whereas a lot of the shift toward industrial policy, toward resilience, is premised on an idea of inevitable competition. And so I think mediating between that idea of cooperation and competition is going to be a really important goal for regulators and others in the coming years.
Frank, thanks so much. Simon?
Yeah, I'll follow on from Frank's observations, most of which I agree with, but one of the problems is the translation precisely that Jinhua was talking about from theory to practice. So I would agree about sentencing, and Singapore's Chief Justice has said we're not going down that path in terms of AI sentencing. But another red line that many people would draw, and maybe it's at the extreme end of Ed's very nice graph, way past the red line, is things like lethal autonomous weapons, where in theory many people would agree, but it seems pretty clear they've already been deployed. In Ukraine, actually probably back in 2020 in Libya, there are suggestions that autonomous drones with killing capacity were already deployed. So we've got this collective action problem. And the response of states is to hesitate, because there's a wariness of under-regulation if you expose your citizens to risk. But probably most states are more worried about over-regulation and the potential of driving innovation elsewhere. The European Union is an interesting example of a jurisdiction that sort of went in one direction. And that sort of map that Ed had of the different approaches around the world points to the horizontal challenge, whether you go down the kind of more rights-based approach of the European Union, the kind of market-based or arguably dysfunctional approach of the United States, or a kind of national security lens through which China has tended to approach this. But in many ways, that horizontal debate, I think, is less important than the vertical debate in all states between government and industry. And if you like and many of you know this, many of you are involved in this, the biggest shift over the last 12 years or so of the machine learning revolution is the move from public to private. That what are now the large language models started in universities, often publicly funded universities, and now it's almost all happening in industry. And so that leads to big challenges for governments trying to regulate entities where they lack the capacity, they lack the understanding, they lack the knowledge. And the consequence is you have this really exciting period of new AI tools being released all of the time with ever less oversight, it seems. And the pressure in terms of industry tends to be, it seems, much more let's push products out quickly rather than do a lot of safety and security. And we can debate whether that's true or not, but I think pretty clear arguments. One answer to this would be international coordination, and I'll talk more about this later, but all I'll say for the moment is, unfortunately, there's a mismatch. There's a complete disjunction between influence and interest, because those with the greatest influence over AI policy is the corporations that have the least interest in holding back. Those with the greatest interest are bodies like the United Nations, NGOs, civil society, wonks like me and Frank, and we have the least influence.
So humbly stated.
I have the least influence, Frank.
Super. On that note, Dr. Lee, please.
Thanks, Ed. But also a very good morning to Mr. Kwek Tong Boon and also Professor Liu Bao Chen. Two of them are my very important mentors in my life. When I was in I2R, I worked a lot with MIT and also SMART, so very good to be back here. But more recently, I have shifted some of my topic to quantum and nuclear. So now recently we have appointed, ST Engineering has appointed a ST Engineering distinguished professor, Michael Short from MIT, from Plasma Lab, to help us on the nuclear material. Now coming back to here, we can debate, whether the industry will be very eager to push out AI, but from the developer and the user point of view, the development of the AI governance is, of course, critical in ensuring the ethical and responsible use of AI. Of course, for a global company like ST Engineering, we monitor closely the development and, of course, will put in necessary governance and tools to implement it. From the implementation of the AI governance and the manufacturing of it at the technology level, there will be tools, there will be standards that will be required. This is very similar to the work that actually I work with Simon on, and also together with Singapore Land Transport Authority on the governance of autonomous vehicle. Now, when we think about the implementation of the governance necessary, we need to define the standard and also certification. Now, in order to execute that, you need circuit. The circuit that allows the autonomous vehicle to run around. So there's the testing circuit, there's a test bed. You need testing tools. So I see that AI will go in that direction as well. If not, you cannot certify it, you cannot meet the minimum requirement that has been defined by the governance. So Singapore government, IMDA, the project AI Verify is a good direction. It's important, there are a lot of challenges, and especially with generative AI, they are trying to execute Project Moonshot. Is going to be challenging, and we can discuss that further. Thank you.
Super. Let's get it kicked off. Frank, I'm going to start with you. So, as I heard the context that was shared by Simon, I thought it would be good to get your perspectives on the United States. So, the recent U.S. Supreme Court decision repealing Chevron deference in administrative settings, it's raised some real concerns about U.S. agencies' future role in articulating AI policy. Could you address this a little more?
Oh, sure, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really interesting perspective, and it is coming from a U.S. perspective, but I think that the issues it raises in terms of the integration of scientific expertise, legal regularity, and political legitimacy are general issues. So just to begin with some background, I mean, just this, we've had administrative agencies that for decades have integrated scientific experts into their interpretation of law. So, and the reason for that, for example, is imagine if you have an environmental standard, a parliament or Congress can articulate and say, please make sure the air is clean enough so that we protect health and safety. They are not expert enough to say there should be 10 parts per million of particulates as opposed to 5 parts per million of particulates, right? So part of what agencies like the Environmental Protection Agencies, others have been doing, is they bring in experts to sort of say, well, let's do some very sophisticated both scientific and economic modeling of what are the optimal levels of pollution in the air. And what was happening in the 60s and 70s is sometimes they would be overruled by judges, sometimes they would not be overruled. In 1984, there was sort of an uneasy peace brokered by this decision called Chevron, which essentially said that judges should recognize the expertise of scientists in many different areas. And it goes beyond that, but for our purposes, that's one of the most important holdings. What's remarkable is that exactly 40 years later, the current Supreme Court has said, no, it really is emphatically the province of the judiciary to offer the best interpretation of the law in many areas. And what rather ironically happened is that in the decision, sort of this something of a judicial power grab, one of the justices who wrote it actually confused nitrous oxide and nitrogen oxide in the decision. And these are certainly, the top legal authorities in the U.S. Were writing this thing. And so the problem that I think that to bring it back to AI policy is that one of the hopes that I had as a member of the National AI Advisory Committee under President Biden was that we would see a lot more integration of expertise in the articulation of policies and some level of stability there. And this sort of throws that a bit into question by emphasizing judicial prerogatives to interpret the law. So I think the lesson here is that, in developing this balance, I think that we're going to have to really look for a better integration of political legitimacy, legal regularity, and science. Hopefully, there will not be too much activism in the area by courts in areas where they're deeply scientifically informed. But it is a very important new development that I think is useful for those in AI policy to be aware of not only the substantive regulation, but also the legal background.
Super. Thank you, Frank. Brian, let me switch gears. So big tech's investing heavily in the performance and capability of LLMs. Singapore, honestly, is unlikely to match up to the same level of investments, has relatively less available data for training and compute. What then should Singapore prioritize in terms of AI R&D?
So if we take a look at what the big techs are doing, they focus a lot on performance. And because of that, they develop models that are what I call black box. That means you have no access to what's going on in the model, right? And even for the companies like Meta, they develop what they call white box models, but you don't exactly know what is the data composition or how they select the data to form it, right? So they did this, and rightly so, because of the profits, right? Now, on the other hand, if we take a look at what Singapore can champion, we can, in fact, think about developing fully open-sourced small models. By small, I mean that it is less data hungry, it's less compute hungry. By fully open source, I mean that the data composition, the source code, and the model architecture, they are all made known, right, to the public. Now, what does that serve? The practical implication could be that all the companies and the various sectors, including the industry, the government, and the academia, would have access to it to continue its development. Imagine my own secondary school child being able to have access to it, right? That's at no cost, right? So that would be great. Now, at the same time, the policy and governance decisions can actually be built in as well, right?
Okay, super. Simon, I'm going to switch to you. We've been speaking about some of the specific national policies in the U.S. and in Singapore. I'd love your kind of more global perspective, particularly on the UN process that's ongoing to seek a kind of a thin measure of international coordination and corporate self-regulation. It's also linked with the different ways in which various countries approach this, particularly in developing countries, global south, where misuse of AI honestly is less of a concern than misuses.
Yeah, exactly. And when you take part in these sort of global conversations, it's a very different set of subject matters. And I think one of the things that we need to look at the global level is how to make it in everyone's interest to have some common rules of the road. I mean, I mentioned that lethal autonomous weapons appear to have been deployed in Ukraine. That wasn't because Ukraine wanted to sort of violate the law. It was just very easy for people to solve problems online. And that's the regulatory challenge, that this technology is global. This technology doesn't care about borders. And so although people like me and others have sort of written for some years about the possibility of an international artificial intelligence agency, the idea being that much as the development of nuclear energy combined real potential for harm along with real potential benefits, and you end up with a compromise in the International Atomic Energy Agency. There's no appetite at the global level for anything like that yet. But there is a recognition that you need some common rules of the road and some common opportunities. So the UN AI advisory body has recently concluded its final meeting in Singapore. I don't think I'm violating any confidences. The report won't be out until September, but basically what it's going to say is we need start with some common understanding. We need to have some kind of scientific panel that will share information, give us sort of a basic language of understanding the opportunities, but also the threats of AI. Secondly, we need common ground. We need common policy frameworks. Not the UN running this, but having a kind of dialogue between states so that more voices are included. So it's not just your map of sort of what the EU, what the US, what China's doing, or even those sort of international collaborations. So the top 7 global initiative, notionally global initiatives, like the sort of G7, OECD, Bletchley Park, and so on. There's a table in the report which basically points out that fully 108 countries, more than half the world's population, more than half the world's countries, are not involved at all in any of them. So we need to broaden that conversation if it's going to be effective, but also if it's going to be legitimate. And this is back to sort of the point about equity, that we need common benefits. We need to have some kind of opportunity for international buy-in. And so there's a really interesting suggestion or set of suggestions about how we can expand access to all the positive sides of this technology, which requires compute, talent, and data. So talent is an issue. So there's initiatives on training, talent development. The UN's been reasonably good at that in the past in terms of upskilling people. Data, one of the issues with data is not just the misuse of data, but the missing data. There are whole sections of the world where there's just not the level of data that will enable people to take advantage of the opportunities. And then one of the biggest challenges is compute. And one thing we're trying to avoid is the kind of unfunded mandate that we say, yeah, everyone should have access to a supercomputer. Well, even in Singapore, we struggle sometimes to get access to supercomputers. Companies are fighting over GPUs. So rather than that, there's an effort to look at funding mechanisms that will enable sort of in-kind support. So not that you build a supercomputer in every country in Africa, but that African countries, other developing countries have access to computational power that will help them. And a thin level of coordination, as you said, so that hopefully the end result is you have sort of a common understanding of risks, common sort of at least discussion about how to manage those risks, but also a common discussion about how to leverage the many opportunities of AI that I think are at the heart of this project that we're talking about.
No, I appreciate that. So I think it gives the whole audience some optimism, at least, that there is some path towards a roadmap. We look forward to September. Dr. Lee, you mentioned in your opening remarks that we need tools to certify AI, and it's much more challenging to certify generative AI. Could you kind of go into that a bit more?
Yeah, I still at the beginning stage of learning because generative AI is still evolving. But I thought that at this stage, I see that there are 2 new challenges generated by generative AI. First is the problem of unknown unknown. The second is the problem of cybersecurity. So the problem of unknown is that we know that the basis and the fundamental science of AI is probabilistics, statistical learning. And because of that, there will be errors. And now you put trillions data together with hundreds and multiples of models together. You hope that they extrapolate and generate something good. But it can be unknown, as we know it. So when you implement the policy, try to implement the policy and the governance on developing certification tools, how can you at that moment develop tools that address unknown? So I see that in a practical sense, the human in the loop will be there for a while, and coupled with the rapid evolution of the generative AI, the human in the loop will be there for a long while. Why human in the loop? Like say we take the autonomous vehicle, right? Eventually you do not know how the pedestrian will respond, will behave, how the vehicle will behave. So therefore to safeguard, you will have a safety driver. So same thing in the AI and the generative AI, I see that will be a trend. So therefore, in terms of the certification tools, it will be a combination of technology and human in the loop. The second point is cybersecurity. So when we talk about certification, right, it's good to go, safe to use. But actually, the generative AI presented a lot more new attack surfaces for hackers. Why is that so? Firstly, you got new thing called prompt injection, prompt engineering. Now that is a way of input, and my researcher in my lab has proved to me and showed to me that they have found vulnerability in Microsoft. Of course, we are white hat. So we report promptly to Microsoft. But you can see that it's not difficult to find fault in the new area of prompt injection, and as well as you can attack the model to make it more toxic, hallucinate more, and it can be more biased. Now the question is that, how are we going to implement a certification that safeguard against all these future attack on the generative AI? So this will be an ongoing effort. If we bring back to the arena of IT security, there will be many startups, many new companies evolve to address very specific vulnerability. And it will be fragmented. The industry will be fragmented, the technology will be fragmented. And that will be the trend, and that will be the new environment that we have to accept as we embrace generative AI.
Super. I've got a question for the audience. First, what would be the quote unquote safety driver for AI, and who would regulate that?
So I'll say one thing that I don't think will make it into the final report from the UN, which is that if we don't create some agency with actual enforcement powers in time to prevent the first AI emergency, we might not have time to prevent the second. But more seriously, I mean, the reason we have an International Atomic Energy Agency is not the nuclear research that went on in 1943 and onwards. It was the two bombs that were detonated in 1945. And it's true that at the international level, international peace and security architecture is driven by crisis. We only got the League of Nations because of World War I. We only got the UN because of World War II. And the difference between them, the reason the UN has teeth in terms of the Security Council, is that rather than being one treaty among many negotiated in Versailles in 1919, the UN treaty was negotiated while the bombs of the Second World War were still falling. And so in the absence of that kind of crisis, I really struggle to see a circumstance in which America, China, Russia, the European Union would agree to something that really was intrusive or coercive. So in the absence of that, we've got to start with coordination, but be ready and have these conversations. So the AI Safety Institutes are, I think, are a good initiative about those risks as well as the opportunities.
Super. There's another question for the panel. I think it might be best for Brian or Professor Lee. Interest in the view on physics-informed machine learning, and is Singapore investing in this?
Right. I guess Chuan can address that later on in his
Yes.
keynote speech, because he's going to talk about AI for the sciences. But yes, I would say that the faculties of science and School of Computing, we are very active in this area on physics-informed neural networks. I can say that more importantly, one of the recent works that we have been looking into is how can we reduce the amount of data requirements, right, to be able to build such a physics-informed neural network at scale, right? So that's something that has not been considered before, and that's something that we have published this year.
Dr. Lee, any comments on this?
I'll just add a point. This is not my area, but I'll try. I think that because of the quantum computing, people are more confident in the behavior of the quantum and how it is being used for computing. And as a result of that trend, there will be new observation and new way of forming the qubits together for computing. Now that inform the AI development as well, the machine learning. And therefore, this is a new way of intermediate step called quantum machine learning. So that's one. The other one is I just thought that, Simon mentioned about the US and the China and, other areas or that. I think beyond the technology and the governance and the policy, the other one is impact on the social norm by generative AI. Why is that so? You ask the generative AI because now everybody is having their own data, their model. So you ask them about the social norm. Things like, is Taiwan belongs to China? You will get different answer. Things like, who is God? What is God? You will get different answer from the West, from the East, and from the Muslim. Right? So therefore, the impact, the longer term impact on our social norm, how we interact with each other, how our mental model is being formed, how our kids develop, what is in the world, is going to be very significant.
Super. That wraps us up on time. I wanted to ask the audience, please give a big round of applause for our panel. Thank you very much.